challenging times of our lives. As an artist collaboration, we've given shape and depth to some of the most complicated topics of our time, making them easily accessible for those who seek to understand. We've given voice and space to the stories that often go ignored. Please take a moment to consider being a patron, make a donation, or join Rockfin. Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to Pullquote.
Welcome to Pullquote, guys. Thanks for joining us today. We are so excited to bring you my friend Jeffrey Kaye. Jeff is a retired clinical psychologist, a researcher, and anti-torture activist. He is the author of Cover Up at Guantanamo Bay, the NCIS investigation into the suicides of Mohammed al-Hanashi and Abdul Rahman al-Amri. His most recent major work is the groundbreaking article on Medium, A Real Flood of Bacteria and Germs, Communications Intelligence and Charges of U.S. Germ Warfare during the Korean War. Based on original research, the article relies on declassified CIA documents to expose the United States' use of biological weapons during the Korean War. So,
welcome to Pullquote.
Welcome to Pullquote.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Good to be here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We're very thrilled to have you here. You've done such good work over the years. I think one of the first times I ever heard you talk was years ago when you were with Jeremy Scahill, when you were talking about it's been years. It's been
Army Field Manual, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. Torture.
Torture. Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, I like that you have such short titles of your works.
Right?
I know. Well, if brevity is the soul of wit, I need to learn to be wittier.
Right. Yeah, we and your latest article, I know there's a few, all of your articles are really dense, very detailed reads, and it's I know that when you spoke with Hervoge at Geopolitics and Empire about 9 months ago, he was like, whoa, it was difficult to get through, but
yeah. Well, part of the problem is the things I write about there's no reference point because it's usually not, these are things that have been totally left out of history, left out of modern reporting. So it's hard, there's no, so it's one thing to say cover up at Guantanamo. Well, that works pretty well. You can just use it as that, but it could be about a lot of different cover-ups at Guantanamo, torture in general. But other things, particularly the work on the Korean War, I know you'll get to, is, these are decades-old topics, and it's hard to, the American public already has demonized North Korea. So to break through it, you have to say something that pulls in the readers or those people who are interested. I don't know how successfully I've done it, but I try and do my best.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to ask anybody joining us today, how's the audio? Do we have the correct audio? And you want to check our make sure that our audio. Jeff, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Good. Everything's good.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
We always like to check we should have done that first.
Right.
I got a little excited, so jump right in. I think what JP wants to do is read a quote from your Counterpunch article from April of 2021.
Right. So this is titled, this is on Counterpunch for those of you out there. And let me bring that up here. So this is called The New Revelations of Germ Warfare. It's time for a reckoning with our history from the Korean War. The quote goes, early on in your comprehensive April 20... Oh, I'm sorry. That's what I was supposed to ask. The Littenberg-Weathersby documents allege that communist infighting over the bioweapon hoax, that's in quotations. Yeah, you don't have to turn that on. That's fine. Led to a cessation of communist charges of germ warfare by early 1953. But that's not true. The charges continued throughout 1953 and for long afterward. Even more telling, the CWIHP documents fail to tell a coherent story moving around the date of the alleged falsification of bioweapon attack sites from before to then after an international team of investigators arrived to examine the charges. The date is crucial because the time to organize a large-scale deception, one that would involve hundreds of eyewitnesses, reports given to investigators, the collection of bomb fragments, the testing materials, and samples from alleged bacterial attack would take some time if it could be successfully done at all. And
Right.
so, you know, what I found interesting in this article was all the. Well, why don't actually, before I go into what I'm thinking about, give us some context around this particular quote that I just read.
Right. You know, when it happened in 1952, that the North Korean foreign minister, followed a week or so later by the Chinese foreign minister, came out with statements to the world saying that the United States is attacking us with biological weapons, with germ weapons. These are the same kind of weapons that were used against us by the Japanese militarists during the what we know of as the World War II, during the 1940s. That that caused a tremendous controversy. A tremendous. I mean, this was huge. The U.S. was, accused of using weapons of mass destruction in the Korean War of a sort that most people feel extremely queasy about. I mean, dropping fleas, in fact, that had been bred to hold plague, bubonic plague, the same thing that caused the Black Death in Europe and killed millions of people, were being dropped in Korea. Beetles that had been sprayed with anthrax. Particles dropped, and in fact, people inhaled it and got inhalational anthrax. Other types of horrifying.
Looks like he froze a bit.
Yeah.
All this shifting around.
Yes.
Anyway,
what?
We had a little freezing.
Yeah. We have some connection issues.
One of the things that I thought was interesting. Oh, I'm sorry. There you are. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. One of the things I thought was interesting was the idea of the feather bomb. And I was like, feather bomb. As I was reading, I'm like, what is the feather bomb? Is it like, these are little, I know that it was a cluster bomb also that was being, utilized, but I thought, well, maybe they're smaller, lighter bombs. And then I kept reading and realized, oh, they were actual feathers that they used that were infected.
Yes. Well, some British historians found people in the British Army that said that they were literally being hand spread in some villages. See, most people don't. In the Korean War, in the winter of 1952, early 52, very late 51, the Chinese entered the war. Actually, they entered it in late October of 1951, and the United States was overwhelmed. The U.S. under General MacArthur had pushed troops all the way up to the Yalu River, the border of North Korea and China, and MacArthur and other people in the Pentagon were pushing to invade China, overthrow the new communist regime, drop atom bombs if necessary. And atom bombs, in fact, were taken from the United States mainland and shipped to Asia to be ready in case they were going to be used. And the feather bomb, but they ended up not using atomic weapons, but they did use, because they were in pell-mell retreat, they did they needed something to disorganize and disrupt the Chinese and North Korean advance that had thrown the United States forces back in the largest, really, military defeat the U.S. had ever had, except perhaps the one in the Philippines in World War II against the Japanese, and threw them back from the 38, from the border of China all the way past south of the 38th parallel. And they were accused of spreading feathers, but they were also feather bombs. And with the feather bombs, they would take feathers, they would dust the feathers with, biologically infected materials that would stick to the feathers, and dust and various things, and then they loaded them into what were the same kind of bombs, not the cluster bombs, which was used for a different kind of material, but into bombs that held propaganda leaflets. But rather than propaganda leaflets, it would explode a little bit above ground and spread all these propaganda leaflets. You must surrender. The bombing is coming. The communists are terrible. Whatever. And instead, they would spread feathers and sometimes other materials, apparently, and float down. And the idea that people would infect the ground, or people would come and pick them up, get infected, maybe spread that infection, or if not, certainly die, and if nothing else, spread terror in the population that they were being bombarded by deadly organisms.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a fellow cyclist. We'd ride to work the same route every day, and he told me he was riding along one time and ingested like a pigeon feather. And he got really sick as a result. So I'm wondering if,
Well, yeah, birds carry their own, in fact, bacteria. I remember, it reminds me when I was a kid, my mother, I don't know why, said, "Don't ever touch a dead bird."
Yeah, I remember that too. Yeah,
every parent tells their kid, well, because they've got bacteria, they're dying, they carry disease, and as do many insects. So you mentioned these Leitenberg's and Weathersby's documents. What happened was in 1998, just as another major academic work was coming out, setting out an incredibly strong case for the U.S. use of biological weapons in the Korean War. The scholars from Canada had been allowed to look at the Chinese archives, etc. These two Cold War scholars, Milton Leitenberg and Catherine Weathersby, published an article for this Cold War International History Project, part of the Woodrow Wilson Center, all heavily financed by the U.S. government. And what they said is they had seen documents that had been found by a kind of a right-wing Japanese newspaper, and no one could actually see the documents. A Japanese journalist had hand-copied them down, then typewritten them out, and somehow they got into the hands of these scholars. And the documents said that this was all a hoax, that actually now we discovered after many years that these documents from within Soviet archives, in which a report was written by Soviet advisors to the North Koreans right during the Korean War, saying the Koreans came to us, they wanted us to fake sites, and we helped them do it. And then supposedly that report was suppressed by the Soviet secret police, the guy who was heading it. So this was all part of a conflict about after Stalin died, between who was running the secret police, who was going to take over after Stalin. And I believe, in fact, these documents are probably mostly true, believe it or not. And this is only after looking at them over time, because they're filled with so many inaccuracies. It's hard for me to believe that anyone would fake these documents. So, because it's so easy. You mentioned 1953.
Yeah.
So they claim that the communists, that the Kremlin found this out. They put their fist down and they said, "No more are we going to talk about germ warfare. You've really harmed our reputation here. There was no germ warfare, and now we have to deal with it. We're just going to cut off everything." China cut it off, and North Korea stopped reporting on it. So thanks to the internet, all I had to do, I said, well, let's check that out. Maybe that happened. I don't know. But in fact, there were continual reports by the Chinese. You can see it in old newspaper files. You can see it in documents that the CIA put out in 1953. And finally, and most importantly, in 1953, in both, I believe it was March, but also much later in November, the Chinese released transcripts important transcripts of depositions given by United States Air Force and Marine personnel, including high-ranking colonels who had been involved in the air campaign of biological warfare against North Korea and China. And these, quote, confessions detailed, how these things came about, who was in charge, where the orders came from, how it evolved over time, because it started out first as an experimental program and then was widened in mid-1952, according to one Marine Corps colonel. And then, of course, what happened, this caused a huge stir. But anyway, all of that proves that what was said in these documents, and was said by Lightenberg and Weathersby, was meant to hide the fact. I mean, I can think of no other reason, unless they're just shoddy researchers, which is also a possibility.
That is a possibility.
But to hide the fact that in 1953, in fact, there was stupendous revelations about this biological warfare campaign that was ongoing until just about the time of the armistice, which was in 1953. And so anyway, yeah, that's the story.
Well, it's funny that both sides seem to be we're suppressing this story at one point. Then I guess, right?
Well, the Chinese, so far as I know, and the North Koreans never suppressed the story. They just stopped talking about it after a while, but they would bring it up now and then. I mean, what can you do? I talked for a long time about, which we're going to go into, the deaths at Guantanamo, or I've talked about, how a U.S. Navy captain who was a special assistant to a major admiral reported to a government official board that there were unreported deaths at Guantanamo in the very earliest weeks that it opened. I mean, that's, I talked to the people involved, and yet no one picked up on it. I'm talking about it now, but in general, I finally stopped talking about it. But it was it's a major issue. It was a major unknown thing. And you just can't keep talking about everything all the time.
Right. Well, I noticed, I mean, there was, you mentioned in that quote that I read, there was communist infighting. So it sounds to me like, you had the sort of like the Soviets were like trying to save face, especially around the time of Stalin's death. And wasn't that also sort of the same period of time when the Soviets and the Chinese were kind of like, their relationship was kind of fizzling?
Well, the relationship had tensions in 1953, but it would be another 4 or 5 years before those would break out in a major way. But by 1953, so the Soviets, they were supplying air, pilots to the communist forces in the Korean War and fighting air battles against U.S. pilots, and they were supplying material, and not as much as the Chinese and Koreans might have liked, however, of course. But yeah, when Stalin died, a section of the bureaucracy run by a man, name of, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing this right, Lavrenti Beria, who was the head of the secret police, hoped that he was going to become the new head of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that he was using against his rivals was the germ warfare accusations, and he was going to do a frame-up, just as the Stalinists had done other frame-ups against other people internally in the Soviet Union and put them away. 10 years or more earlier, during the purges that had occurred in the late 30s. So what's funny is how much these Cold War warriors, scholars like Milton Lightenberg or the Wilson Center embrace this head of the Soviet secret police and believe implicitly everything he said about all this. But go ahead. It looks like you're talking, but I'm not hearing you.
That's because I was muted.
Okay.
You mentioned something about a right-wing Japanese newspaper. Now, was that something that those researchers were relying on as far as like a resource?
Yeah, that was their resource.
That was their resource.
That was it. They published. Yeah, that paper published these documents. No one to this day has ever actually seen the documents. I wrote to Milton Lightenberg, and he assumed I was questioning him, as other people have, about the provenance of these documents. I wasn't, but he's so sensitive about it because no one's actually still ever seen them. But he goes, well, but other people have told me, and I found evidence that this kind of issue arose. You know, I hear you, but my criticism of the documents had nothing to do with how they originated, actually, despite the fact that they really have to do with things like you mentioned, you're getting to the crux of it, where key elements of this supposed frame-up of the United States in terms of using biological warfare was timeline was skipped around. You know, so in one set of the documents, it says in March of 2019. Here's the timeline. In February 26th or 27th, the North Koreans come to their Soviet advisor, and they say, "Hey, we hear these people are coming to do an investigation. They're coming from Europe. They're going to be here in like less than a week, and we don't have the evidence to show them about biological warfare. Please help us, oh Soviet advisors." And so supposedly they all got together and they concocted something where they would create 2 different sites of fake biological attack. And they would even kill some prisoners and infect them with, with biological organisms to be the victims that we can then present to the world. So it all, these other Soviet advisors heard about it and thought this was awful, and they sent a report about it in early March before these investigators arrived. They arrived on March 3rd, so early March has to be March 1st or 2nd. So on March 1st or 2nd, they send a report back to Moscow saying, "Look at what's happening here." You know, the guy gets the report. He's the head of the secret police, and he just puts it in a drawer, supposedly, allegedly, and hides it away. Right. And then somehow it doesn't come to the attention of Beria and his people until a year later. And how that happens, we don't know. But so supposedly they find out, they put him on trial. This guy who hid the report, supposedly, they put him on trial, and the trial says, yeah, the report came to you in April of 1953, not March, April. That's after the investigators left. So what are they saying? It's unclear why they made the switch. So that you have 2 different dates. We could go into what that means. I could talk for a long time about it. Listeners will get kind of bored, I think. But the main point is these documents are unreliable. They can't even keep their story straight, in other words. Right. Yeah. You know, they say that the reports of germ warfare were stopped by the Kremlin in 1953. No, they weren't. They say that the report about the faking of the biological attack sites happened in March of 1953. Then later, oh no, actually it happened in April. They, by the way, 2 sites, but the investigators who they're talking about who came, they were called, this organization still exists today, I was surprised to find out. It's called the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the IADL. And it still exists. And they came there and they looked at the evidence, and they did conclude that the United States was involved in many atrocities. The biological warfare was only one of them. You know, killing of civilians, etc. And these kind of things have been proven out over the years. But at the time, these people were dubbed communist dupes in the West. You know, and so the report was and it wasn't spread. And one other diabolical thing occurred. In fact, I only learned this a few months ago, and then I wrote an article about it. And I was kind of blown away. It's hard to believe someone like myself is still as naive as I am about how diabolical this cover-up was. So in 1951, the United States clapped Postal Service and the Customs Service resurrected a policy they used during World War II, which they would intercept all mails coming in from overseas, and any mail that was coming from, quote, Iron Curtain countries, which I don't know if your listeners know, but the Iron Curtain was supposedly those countries living behind communism. We're still seeing some of that kind of, the resurrection of that kind of language and propaganda now against Cuba and China.
Wasn't that Churchill's expression?
Yeah, Churchill
Yeah.
said it first.
Yeah.
Correct. It was picked up by the press. And anyway, so any communist country, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, China, North Korea, in those days, they were intercepting any mail that came, and they were just anything that was deemed propaganda, and destroying it. And in one instance that I found in testimony that was given by a U.S. Customs Service, I think it was official to Congress, talking about this program, that in 1 year alone, or excuse me, 1 month alone, they destroyed 900,000 pieces of mail just in one of the centers in New York City. So they were keeping this information from coming in. So there's a reason that you can't go to your library and just get the IADL report and look at it. Now, thanks to the internet, these things have been posted finally online, and I posted one of the things, which was the investigators who came later in the year, who were scientific in nature, not legal. So they carried a lot more weight, and they were headed by a very famous British scientist by the name of Joseph Needham, who was a biochemist and later became a famous historian of science, and very much associated with Cambridge University. And that was their report, which ran to almost 700 pages with copious documentation. This is part of what got me started here, by the way. It was unfindable in any simple way in the United States. A couple of copies may have existed in 1 or 2 archives, like the Hoover Institute. But just an average Joe like myself, or even an average researcher, was going to have some difficulty in tracking it down. I finally got a copy. I digitized it and I put it online.
The archives at the Hoover Institute?
I believe the archives at the Hoover Institute, I'm not sure, might have kept one copy.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing that an institute like that would carry that information in their archives.
Well, they carry, they very much about the Cold War, and so they carry a lot of information from the communist side as well. And
that's great. That's interesting. Yeah.
It is interesting. I would like to direct our listeners and our viewers to your latest article on your Medium page. It's entitled "The Schnacky Affidavit: U.S. Admission of Offensive Germ Warfare Capability During the Korean War." So this is a continuation of your ongoing investigation. And this article was literally just dropped like 2 days ago. You just published this 2 days ago.
Yes.
I'm going to read a quote from that, and then we'll let you talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
In the affidavit, which provides us today with 2 important pieces of the biowarfare puzzle surrounding the charges of germ warfare aimed at the United States, Schnacky stipulated the presence of an offensive capability by the U.S. to wage biological warfare dating back to the beginning of 1949, something the U.S. had long hidden or denied. The revelation briefly made headlines in San Francisco, where the trial was being held, but more generally faded away. So take it away.
Yeah, well, this was the trial of John William Powell, or I believe John W. Powell, who was a journalist, and the other defendants were his wife and another associate who had worked at a journal called the China Monthly Review, which John Powell had taken over from his father, who had ran it in China for many years prior to his son taking it over in the early 50s. And there he is living in China right at the time when the Korean War breaks out. So he starts reporting on that. And of course, he reports things that the Chinese say and the North Koreans say. And that included the charges of biological warfare. When John Powell returns to the United States in either late 53 or 54, he's charged by the Americans with sedition. Everyone who knows about the Julian Assange case and everything, or knows about the Pentagon Papers, knows that the attempts of the United States government to stop classified material or material they don't like from becoming public. So because John Powell published this information, he was put on trial for sedition. His journalistic career was destroyed. and he was threatened, with many, many years in prison. And the ACLU took up his case and provided attorneys. And this affidavit comes from that case, which, by the way, ended in a mistrial. The charges were refiled then for treason against John Powell, until finally in the 1960s, the case was dropped by then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. This affidavit is because they were using a defense technique that is used even today called gray mail. Perhaps you've heard of it. Which you're in a national security case and you're accused of doing something bad, but in the criminal trial you're allowed discovery of other documents of what the government has or knows about this. And so they put out if you read this whole affidavit, you'll get a sense of what the defense was asking for, all sorts of documents, etc., and about biological warfare and the program the U.S. had. And finally, the government not wanting, I don't know why something on my own screen. Whoa, are you there?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, that's bizarre. Okay, why the government didn't want to give up this information, and so they did what's called a stipulation. They said, "All right, we're going, what I might call a limited hangout.
Right.
All right, we're going to admit. I know we said we didn't, but yeah, we did have an offensive capability to wage biological warfare during the Korean War." Now, even let's flash forward to 2016, where the Wilson Institute, again, puts out a monograph by Milton Lightenberg, who's saying, and I quoted in the article where he says, and he's repeated this, and other people have said it. These germ warfare charges were always absurd. The U.S. never had even the capability. Yes, they were working on biological weaponry, but mostly defensively. They weren't allowed to use it offensively, and hence they didn't even have an offensive weapon. And when they finally came up with one, it was just one, and it was the Korean War. The Korean War was already over. Well, this shows that was a lie, and this is, I think that the Wilson Institute should retract that entire document, the 2016 monograph by Milton Lightenberg, but they're not going to do that. But what this article shows is that the United States, and it goes into great detail what really lies, what's the background to the U.S. What was the U.S. biological warfare program. Others have written about this, including, by the way, a very well-known author, Nicholson Baker, in his new book called Baseless, which came out last year. I also wrote a book review of that book, and a counterpunch people can read. But he also talked about a great deal of the research that went on at that time. He said, I recommend the book with certain reservations, but I recommend it.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you something about that, but it just slipped my mind. So, but this document that the Wilson Institute put out, and this guy, you said you contacted him. He's still alive?
Oh yeah, he's still alive.
Researcher,
Milton Lightenberg. He's still alive. I don't know how old he is. Yeah, I said, I've got questions. Let me ask you, why is it you never mentioned, for instance, in these 1998 documents, the different dates for this? Why did you never mention that? Why did you say that the communist accusations of biological warfare ended in 1953 when that was demonstratively not true?
Mm-hmm. Well,
he wrote back and said, "You cherry pick what you want to talk about. Don't ever write me again." And then he red-baited me because I gave an interview to a vlog that is obviously pro-China at one point, and that was it. And said, "Don't write me again."
Wow.
Yeah.
Guilty by association. That happens a lot on the internet.
It sure does.
Yeah. So watch out, you guys.
I know, right? Well, I did have a question, or I did have a comment or a question, kind of.
Yeah.
First of all, how effective do you think that this program actually was in regard to the Korean War? Because I remember your interview on Geopolitics and Empire, where you were talking about how,
Mhm.
there were a lot of like forwards and retreats and at the
Mhm.
38th parallel. And so how effective was this in the long term?
Well, I would need to make a definitive statement. I hesitate because I haven't sit down. I've learned in this business you need to really look at all the documents carefully. But I've obviously read a lot about it and looked at a lot of documents. And what I can say is that probably, I mean, almost certainly it was not as effective as the US would have liked. Let's put it that way. I don't know how many people died. We do, and probably, unfortunately, the U.S. secrecy is one of the reasons. The U.S. made a agreement with the Japanese biological warfare people, who were an integral part of what they called the Kwantung Army, the army of Japan had on the Chinese mainland, and that they would hide their work from war crimes investigators and from prosecution. It was led by General Shiro Ishii and Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. And the U.S. not only did that, they prevented the case from being brought before the Tokyo war crimes trials, but then they also absorbed the quid pro quo was the Japanese gave them thousands of slides of and data on what they discovered from their biological warfare experiments, and they experimented on thousands of prisoners, and almost all of those experiments ended fatally. They dissected people alive to look and see how these biological weapons. Anyone who knows about Unit 731, which was also finally didn't come out until 30 or 40 years after the war, after World War II. Anyway, the U.S. was working with these scientists, and what my latest article goes into is that two of those scientists, American scientists, military men, who had argued strenuously for amnestying the Japanese biological warfare criminals and using their expertise as, quote, very valuable for the United States, were then put in key positions of authority right on the eve of the biological warfare campaign in Korea, which was using Japanese methods for the most part. By Japanese methods, I mean the Unit 731 methods of using primarily insect vectors to spread disease, and things like feathers and stuff like that. This was all pioneered in Japan during World War II. And so in China, where thousands, hundreds of thousands really now documented to have died from that, what was set off there, and it was a major military campaign. The U.S. had their own biological warfare campaign, which was focused around anthrax heavily, but also other organisms. But they were mostly interested in sprays and aerosolization of the materials. And it was taking them too long to standardize them. There was a conflict about who was really in charge. Was it the U.S. Air Force? Was it the U.S. Army Chemical Corps? A lot of egos. Things were going slower through big government bureaucracy. And then in 1951, as I said, late 51, when the U.S. was overrun by Chinese and North Korean forces and in danger of total defeat, they turned to biological weaponry to sow discord and confusion, and also to test out on an experimental basis. Would these Japanese methods really work for us? How good were they? Because how well did they work in Japan? The problem is the war criminal Shiro Ishii once said, and this might resonate in what's happening today, it's actually very hard to start a pandemic. It's not so easy. And now we're saying it's not so easy to stop one either. But anyway, the Japanese and North Koreans had a lot of experience already dealing with being, and I say North Koreans, they had not been victimized by Unit 731, but many the North Korean cadre who ran that country had during World War II fought with the Mao's People's Army in China, and they knew very well about the biological warfare they were dealing with it all the time. And so they knew, and when they were ready, and when they got attacked, or they perceived they were being attacked, or whatever, they knew what they had to do. And so that really helped stop the, but in the early days, and if you read my article, which I believe you might refer to, the one with the really long name, A Flood of Bacteria and Germs, in it where I quote CIA documents that themselves were listening in on the communist troops during World War II and secret cryptologists, into their enemy communications. And, this was really a deal breaker for me. If anyway, I still believed that there was any kind of phoniness going on, because here we had a black and white report, U.S. government reports documenting listening in on the biological weapons attacks. And anyway, so what they did, there was a lot of confusion in those, in the initial days of these attacks, but they seemed to get it together to deal with them. So how much damage did it ultimately do? I don't know. But we do know that the war was fought to a standstill, and
okay.
That kind of speaks for that.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned this one. As creatives, as artists, we really appreciated the propaganda that you found through the CIA in this. Go back to the front, the first one.
Yeah, there's some good stuff in
There's
here.
some good images in there. Do you get all of your bring us back? Do you get all of your information from CIA documents, disclosed to the public? How do you do your research? How do you?
Most of this research, believe it or not, has come out through, at least on the Korean War. On Guantanamo, it came through Freedom of Information Act for the most part. To a certain extent, via WikiLeaks, who released a set of documents from in Guantanamo.
Okay.
But I myself have never, received classified material. I only look at material that's been unclassified or posted publicly online.
Okay.
Some of it, like the what you show right there, is a screenshot of an archive from the archives on the Tokyo war crimes trials, of which you can find online. The CIA material, and there's some other pictures if you scroll through, they're quite stunning, comes from a pamphlet the CIA put out. See, in 2010, the department, the historian division of the CIA, and they have their own historians, just as the military has their Army has its own historians, the U.S. Air Force has its own historians. So the CIA put out a pamphlet with its release in 2010 of hundreds of documents from the from the Korean War that had been kept declassified for many years, and they called it "Baptism by Fire" was the name of their release. And I found it kind of by accident online, looking at stuff about the Korean War and the CIA, and now. When I found it, the CIA was, they have a FOIA reading room, or what they call their reading room. And some of the material is there from Freedom of Information Act. Some of it they just decided to release themselves. So far as I can see, all this Korean War material was released not by anyone's request, but because of FOIA. Although people may have wanted them to release it, maybe had FOIA'd in the past, but this release was not the result of a FOIA request per se, or that I know of, or a court decision forcing them to do so. They decided to do it, and they had their own tales they want to tell, and anyone can go online and read it. Right. They were, interested in, and some of that material I do go into in my article about the history of cryptology in the Korean War and how many linguists did they have. And it's very interesting. And it does feed into the question. But what struck me was a handful of these documents, about 24 out of some 300 or 400, concerned biological warfare. And I pulled those documents out, and people who go to that article, you can download and have that 24 or so documents that discuss the Korean War experience of being bombed or otherwise by biological weapons, and or some of the other issues that the North Koreans and the Chinese were talking about during the Korean War is picked up by the forerunner of the NSA, the Armed Forces Security Agency, and then the CIA would write their communications intelligence reports based on, what the AFSA, the Armed Forces Security Agency, had picked up in their secret listening in. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned something about well, you when you were talking about the Japanese being brought in, or the it sort of sounded like the Operation Paperclip kind of thing.
Yeah.
Very similar to that. But ultimately, I'm wondering, do you believe, based on what you've read and the research you've done, that part of the reason for the Korean War was to actually try out some of this stuff, like the new toys?
Well, we could say that about many wars. I mean, whether the cause was, I wouldn't say it was the cause, but it certainly was a happy circumstance. And I believe, I just saw a quote the other day, and I'm sorry I didn't write it down, where MacArthur or someone like that said, thank God that the Korean War came along when it did, because it allowed us to do various things. It helped the Japanese economy, for instance, which was really helped feed the Korean War was like World War II, but all in one country.
Right.
And I mean, the U.S. dropped more bombs on North Korea and more napalm than they had dropped on Europe. I mean, they just totally devastated and wiped out that country. They lived in in tunnels and in caves, and it just astounds me. I sometimes feel the United States, what could be done to undo such a great crime, really a crime of genocide. They essentially tried to wipe out all of North Korea, and the only reason they didn't drop the atom bomb apparently was for fear of widened conflict, which would go nuclear, and the knowledge that the Soviets had nuclear weapons. That's probably the only reason. I mean, they'd already used it in World War II twice.
Right.
Yeah. So, but definitely I believe it was Colonel Frank Schwabel, but others who gave those depositions to the Chinese when of course they were prisoners, and these depositions or confessions were later retracted when they returned to the United States, despite the fact that Chinese said they would put these prisoners on trial for being war criminals. They didn't. They actually sent them back to the United States. They thought that was a gracious effort, because these people had actually committed war crimes. And these people all recanted their confessions under threat of military court-martial, which is often left out.
Right.
Yeah. So they said anyway that this was an experimental program, because they understood they were, these were field tests. And in the documents that I found, there was the Chemical Corps talked about we need large-scale field tests under large-scale military operational conditions. Probably we really could only find out if biological weapons work, they said at one point, when we finally used them in a war. So you know what? They did. Now, they didn't use the weapons that they maybe would have liked to use. They used what they called, later, and I pointed out in my article, stopgap measures. Right. They weren't really ready to go with their bombs that they wanted to. So instead, they went with these other measures. What's missing here, of course, and would be the actual some kind of paper documents, if it exists, showing us the collaboration with Unit 731 people and how that was finally affected. I mean, we have news reports that they were there, but we lack that, and it was a very deep covert. And so I mentioned, well, how did they fool themselves? The Unit 731 stuff was kept only in intelligence circles. People didn't know about it. If you read even their own secret histories, it's not mentioned. But we know it happened now, because later documents were unearthed. But in their own secret history, for instance, of the U.S. Air Force and work with the biological warfare program, there's never a hint of Unit 731 in something called the Stevenson Report, a June 1950 report that was put together about whether what's going on with biological warfare and what should we do with it. And the committee, the Stevenson Committee, advocated use and not get rid of the retaliation only policy and let's use biological weapons. Who had on its 4-man secretariat a man by the name of Edward Wetter, who was one of the people behind the scenes advocating, taking in Unit 7 from the Chemical Corps, the Research and Development Board, who had been intimately involved with the amnesty and work around Unit 731, who spoke highly of how the Japanese biological warfare experts had gathered data that would be extremely valuable to the United States. But none of that's mentioned in the top secret Stevenson report. In other words, this thing was buried very deep, and I think that's one reason why it's hard to get to the truth now.
You mentioned in one of your articles that like some of the orders or some of the directives were verbal only, rather than and I imagine I imagine that also had something to do with it. Burying that stuff. One thing though, I wanted to ask or talk about was how much of this was bio. I mean, like bio warfare could be, chemicals as well as, other types of things. So what was the balance? I mean, do you feel like it was like there were a lot of chemicals that were used as well as pathogens?
Well, the Chemical Corps, U.S. Chemical Corps was responsible for developing biological weaponry, chemical weapons, and radiological weapons.
Right. Okay.
In fact, one of the ways I found out some of this stuff was by looking at the Department of Energy's archives online. So what is the stuff about biological energy doing in the Department of Energy?
Right.
Well, it's because of all the controversies over radiation experiments that were done, if you remember back in the Clinton years, that came out a lot. There was a big investigation and report. Anyway, but you asked me,
how much of a mix do you think there was, like between the biological and the chemical?
There were chemical weapons used. I mean, napalm really is a chemical weapon in a way, and they used white phosphorus as well, and the the Koreans did accuse the U.S. of using other unspecified chemical weapons early in the war, gases, for instance. And we know that the U.S. was working. Unfortunately, I did not allow myself, well, fortunately maybe, I didn't allow myself to get distracted, but many of these documents that I found go into a lot of information about the development of sarin gas, they called it the G gas, nerve weaponry. Nerve gases and bombs and armaments for that. So whether or not the U.S. used chemical weapons or not, to what degree, to me is an unknown at this point. One again would have to sit down. Obviously, the Japanese again used chemical weapons in China in World War II, and I know that the United States came in and inventoried what they used, and they sent a lot of those weapons back to the mainland. And the U.S. definitely had a large-scale chemical warfare research program going on, and by research I mean also munitions and things like that. Did they deploy them? Which ones did they deploy besides what we know about? And also chemical defoliants were used. So later dioxin or Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam. These kind of things were also potentially experimented on and used. And that's so there's a kind of blurry line between chemical weaponry and biological warfare weaponry. And I have not. I can't say that I've just been pretty focused on trying to prove whether or not the U.S. used biological weapons, and so there's so much there that yes, tangentially I've come across this other material, but not enough to say definitively give you the answer on that.
Wow. Did you have a question?
No, I'd like to. We're coming up at the top of the hour, so before we have to say goodbye, I would like to direct our viewers and listeners and followers to your book. So if you want to pull up the image for the
Yeah,
book,
yeah.
and I'm just going to read a very quick
Mm-hmm.
intro to the book. And this is the book on the cover up at Guantanamo Bay, which we mentioned at
Mm-hmm.
the beginning of this broadcast. So Guantanamo has forged a place in the world's consciousness as synonymous with torture. The world's largest military force exerted its power over hundreds of prisoners held for years without rights or hope. Deep within the prison's secretive recesses, over the years, some of its prisoners met with death, most supposedly via suicide. But the circumstances of these deaths were shrouded in mystery and government censorship. Based upon newly released Freedom of Information Act documents, your new book shows that your book shows that earlier reports of cover up in the case of 3 so-called suicides in 2006 extends to subsequent deaths in the Cuba-based U.S. interrogation and detention camp. So, very quickly, because we are
Mm-hmm.
coming up on the top of the hour, I
Okay.
would like to have you talk about your experiences in researching this and what your role was in
Mm-hmm.
uncovering this.
Yeah, you got
Okay.
a few seconds. Go.
Go.
Well,
No, I'm kidding.
well, I assume it's okay if we go a little bit over
Oh,
the
Yeah, of
yeah,
course.
absolutely.
Yes,
Okay, yeah.
yes, absolutely.
But I was working, as you know, Julie, as a psychologist, in San Francisco, and I was working part of the time for a torture treatment center called Survivors International, and I worked with people who had been tortured in other countries, not the United States, who had come to the United States to apply, to escape torture in their own countries, in their places around the world that people I saw from Guatemala, from Burma, from the Philippines, from Russia, from just about everywhere. And our job was to either to give them psychotherapy to help them, or to help them with their asylum applications by producing psychological evaluations of how that affected them. Anyway, so I became very interested in torture. It's not something ordinarily I probably thought about. Although in my own private practice, I had come across people who had been tortured, and a man from Egypt, another guy from El Salvador. And so it became apparent to me, boy, torture really happens a lot. I became interested in it. Then the charges after the Iraq War started of the US involvement in torture of secret CIA sites, and then the involvement of psychologists in constructing and implementing this torture. Well, I and a number of other psychologists became active about that. And what role did the AP, American Psychological Association, play in this, et cetera? And as part of that, what always interests me, and the same thing would happen on the Korea stuff, is when you look and you can't find the information, I just start asking why, right? Why is there not more? Why isn't the major press doing an investigation into why this person died? But the one breakthrough was, of course, the 2006 so-called suicides, where 3 people died. And there was an investigation done by some people at Seton Hall Law School and by Harper's Magazine, Scott Horton, where a whistleblower, Gitmo guard by the name of Joe Hickman, who later wrote his own book, said, hey, no, something nefarious was going on. These people were whisked out and taken to a secret, probably CIA camp at Gitmo called Camp No, and because nobody was supposed to know about it. And then brought back dead, or almost dead, whatever. We don't know the exact story. I found out much later that in the Army report on this, when I was looking into my own book, and this is in the book, you can see the traces of the cover-up, and then you start looking more. So the traces of the cover-up was that everything at Gitmo is supposed to be documented, and it's documented on something about the detainees called the Detainee Information Management System, or DIMS, the DIMS system. It's like the cops always complain, got to go back, I got to read a report about what just happened. Well, at Gitmo, everything, the guard, detainee spit at me, got to go write it up. Somebody else said, I feel like I want to die, got to go write it up. So supposedly everything is written up. But, the guard count, supposedly, like any prison, they make counts periodically throughout the day of, head counts of who's in the prison. And the head count, the Army's own report said the head counts for that night were falsified. but then they did nothing about it. I said, well, that's no big deal because it didn't matter because they were already dead. What? I mean, the whole thing made no sense.
Wow.
So I found out later that, so I was, that's what drove me forward. Why is this not reported? And I feel a sense of personal responsibility. If at the time I was quite ill, I had developed cancer, and serious cancer. And I thought, I don't know how much longer I have. I'm very lucky, and I can thank the surgeons who worked on me, etc. So I have some faith in the medical establishment. They saved my life. But so I kind of rushed out my book. But I felt the material had to get out there because even today I'll say, if I didn't report on it, nobody would. Another example about deaths at Guantanamo that's in the book is that in February 2002, Captain Alan Yund was talking at the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board meeting, along with heads of people from like the CDC was there. And they were talking about Guantanamo at one point. And they said, the guy says, yeah, how's it going? Give us a report from the mortuary department at Guantanamo. And the guy said, okay. Well, yeah, we've had a number of detainees who have died after arriving with injuries from the battlefield. Okay, that's interesting. And they go on and they talk about other things. What? How come I've never heard of that?
Right.
What is that? So I wrote an article up. It's been extremely difficult to get anybody interested in following it up. My article, I interviewed Captain Yund. He said, yeah, I heard it from the head doctor at Gitmo. So I talked to him. He says, I don't know what he's talking about. I don't remember that. Mm-hmm. So he said, she said, but it doesn't take much to think, well, why would this assistant to an admiral, a vice admiral, and a major figure, a captain in the Navy, Alan, why would he lie?
Right.
Why would he make that up? He said, no, he definitely confirmed to me that he heard that. So, and yet not one news agency, not even one alternative news agency or site has seen fit, although Jeremy Scahill did interview me, and I may or may not have brought that up. That was on a different subject. That was about use of torture in the Army Field Manual. Oops, right. Are you there?
Yes.
Yes, we're here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear us okay?
Yes, okay. I can hear you fine. Anyway, I could go on. So that was important. And by the way, there is a link between Guantanamo and the Korea work. This was the link, just so you know, and your listeners know. When the press does write about torture that the U.S. did, that the psychologist did, etc., they say they took these torture techniques and they copied them from the Chinese, who used them against prisoners during the Korean War, so they would give false confessions of the use of biological weapons during the Korean War. So, in fact, I believed that at the time when it first came out. And if you look at very old blog posts of mine, I repeat what they said without, but to myself at one point I go, I would just like to, I'm a psychologist. I like to look at, things psychologically. Boy, I'd like to see what those confessions look like. They must be really bizarre. I mean, I'm working with other torture victims many of them had been forced to say things that were wrong. I'd like to see these confessions. Couldn't find them.
Wow.
In fact, they're nowhere. They're not even in archives in the United States. Now today you can find them online, finally, but not in great shape. No one has really still published them in a way that's, although someone did it at Amazon, I think, but no one has published them until very recently in any form that anyone can read. They're very difficult to find because they give the real info.
Is there a lot of redaction within the documents? Like, is there a lot of
within
those documents? Are there like areas that are blacked out or
you mean the confessions documents?
Yeah.
No, those were published by the Chinese. There's no redactions at all.
Oh no,
they're not government documents. The Guantanamo documents, yes.
Yes.
The other documents, the Korean War documents, yes, there are always redactions. Always redactions. And I have, you asked me earlier, I have done some FOIA work, and I feel the most important thing that I achieved was I got a less redacted version of the CIA's torture manual from 1963, known sometimes as the QBARC manual. QBARC was a name CIA gave to itself on interrogation, and there was a lot of interesting things that came out from that in terms of the government's work with other countries and on torture and the legalities that they were skirting around. But and also things like falsifying testimony, given, manipulating tapes and putting them out there, to make it look like someone said something they didn't.
God.
So yeah, it's pretty dark stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're all laughing in gallows humor style, right?
Right. I understand totally.
Yeah.
Wow. Where can our followers find you?
Well, right now, and I'm considering, other places to put my writing, but right now they can find me at medium.com. I have a website, but I once I started publishing to Medium, I just pretty much put it up there, and that's been that way for the past 4 years or so.
Okay.
So a lot of the stuff I wrote about torture can be found at a website called Invictus, which was at valteensblog.blogspot.com. You could Google me and probably find it.
Yeah,
But,
and I know that you sent us a link of a number of your articles on what is it called?
Medium?
no,
Counterpunch.
Counterpunch, yeah.
yes, and also Counterpunch.
Yeah.
I have published 3 or 4 articles there, and
Right.
I think I'm going to be publishing another one that should intrigue people, which is has to do with MK Ultra kinds of personnel who were involved in the retractions and the prisoners who admitted to biological warfare. It's quite interesting. It's a little of it's been published before. Most recently, I think Tom O'Neill in his very interesting book Chaos about Charles Manson notes the presence of a CIA psychiatrist by the name of Louis West or Louis West, and but I'm going to go into a bit more detail. And there are other people that were involved, and it's the handprints of the CIA are over a lot of this. But I don't want to leave people with the impression this was all CIA. I mean, the U.S. military establishment and national security establishment, defense establishment, really is all one. And they may have their internal different bureaucracies and differences and rivalries, but they're basically all one. And they collaborate and they share personnel, and that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that in one of the articles. I read a number of them, right? So I'm mixing some of them up, but that the CIA had their own planes, but they would use, Army, Marine, Air Force, Navy planes to deliver the materials, at given times.
Yeah.
So I can see that, there is that crossover for sure.
Yeah, they would go, you would get a TDY, temporary assignment. You would be undercover, you're CIA, but you're really, Captain, Smith, in the logistics department, whatever,
Right.
but really you're CIA. Yeah.
Right. Regarding what you said about the psychologist being involved in your uncovering the cover up at Guantanamo Bay. Just as a side note, I discovered recently that the story of Sybil, multiple
yes, the multiple personalities.
Yeah, the multiple personalities. I discovered somebody had I don't know if there's any truth to this or not, but I found it fascinating that she was actually it was actually the psychologist that made her believe that she had the multiple personalities.
Yes, I've read that too, and I wouldn't be surprised. Although, just it's a fascinating topic of the dissociation of personality in general, and the breakdown, and what role doctors can play in manufacturing this. There's a psychiatrist by the name of Colin Ross who's written a lot about this, and of course he believes that some of the CIA programs were meant to induce this kind of breakdown in the personality to create memories, create personalities. Right. And that's, again, super dark stuff, but, so that you could use them to do your dirty work. And then they wouldn't remember what they did.
And they have false memories,
Yes.
So that's really mucking around with people's consciousness and their brains.
Yeah.
And it's really powerful stuff, which I find fascinating.
Yes.
Maybe we
But
can
in
have
terms
another
of
discussion about that.
when it comes to the recantations of the flyers who claimed, after World War II, I would say though that probably there's the experience of being put in isolation, under control of a massive, powerful entity like the Pentagon, not to mention the CIA, and threatened with court-martial or prosecution, with prison, loss of your benefits, loss of, to be anyone who grew up in the 60s like me and watched the show Branded, right? Where they branded, they tear off your insignia and you lose, your pension, you lose money, and you're left in ignorant, you're left in disgrace. That would be enough to probably get most people to put their, to recant.
Yeah,
Right.
well, not only that, the also the sort of the loss of the the band of brothers, right? The kind of the community, or the for lack of a better word, community that's created as a member of the armed forces in any given
Right.
branch, right?
Absolutely, yes.
So that's also stripped away as well, and that
Yes.
shame that goes along with that.
Just awful, yes. So right, basic psychological pressures.
Mhm.
But whether or not, so to what degree, whether or not these darker methods were used, we'll see. You'll be interested probably in what I have to write.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah,
About
I'm
this.
looking forward to it
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
Okay.
we want to thank you so much for coming on board and speaking. It's a lot of
Mhm.
information, and I encourage our listeners and followers to please follow Jeff Kaye and read through all of the documents and information that he's provided. And hopefully we can have you back.
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. And I want to thank both of you, not just for providing me the space to talk, but for your own work and
Thank you.
being socially committed individuals and artists as well, and trying to make something good out of the chaos and craziness that goes on in this world is very important. So it's very important the work that you do.
Thank
Oh,
you.
well,
for
thank
that.
you
Thank
so
you very
much. That
much.
means a lot to us.
It really does.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. All right.
Well, it was
Well-
nice to have you, Jeff, and
Okay.
we'll be right back with you, okay?
Okay, Julie. Thank you.
All
JP,
right,
thanks.
cool. Wow. So
Well, that went fast.
it really did. I did want to mention before I forget that you can hear an hour-long program, Geopolitics and Empire, on his channel. I believe it's on YouTube still.
Yeah, it's still on
Okay.
YouTube.
Okay.
Mhm.
And
know,
so you
right?
can hear an interview with Jeff about the topic that we talked about, and he does get more into the history of the war as well. So if you want to find out more about this topic, that's a good place to go. But the interesting tie-in is that next week we're going to have Hervoge from Geopolitics and Empire as our guest. So
Right. So that'll be fun.
yeah, so that'd be cool. and that's next Wednesday, I believe.
Right. We have a calendar. You guys can find it on our site. You can find it on our channel. Please go to Patreon, become a patron, and support us, so we can continue to bring you these kinds of guests. We have so many excellent people coming up in the future.
Yeah.
Dr. Andrew Kaufman, Dr. Christiane Northrup. We have, like JP just mentioned, Hervoge from Geopolitics and Empire. Lots of guests coming up.
Haruki
Hamada,
which
the
I'm really looking forward
artist.
to,
We
yeah.
are really looking forward to that. So please support us on Patreon, make a donation on PayPal, or join Rockfin, and you can have access to all of our premium content.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, I meant to say this at the beginning of the show. Hello, Rockfin.
Hello, Rockfin.
Hi, Rockfin
fans.
viewers.
Thank you for all your support.
Yeah.
And keep it coming.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
All right, cool. Well, it's been another show.
It's been another excellent edition of
Yeah.
Pullquote. Thank
Yeah.
you for joining us today, guys.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Book of Hours are artists here to empower and embolden your response to the constant negative sound bites that attack your news and social media feeds. In order to continue making the video essays and art you've come to enjoy, we need your support. Make a one-time donation or become a patron. Thank you.